So it is my pleasure to introduce Karen Emmorey, a distinguished professor in the School of Speech, Language, and Hearing Science at San Diego State University and the director of the Laboratory for Language and Cognitive Neuroscience. Dr. Emmorey's research focuses on what sign languages can reveal about the nature of human language, cognition, and brain in general. She studies the processes involved in how deaf and hearing people produce and comprehend sign language and how these processes are represented in the brain. Among other things, Dr. Emmorey has been involved in projects conducting a quantitative analysis of the semantic organization of the ASL lexicon on a large set of data. So, dear Karen, now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And sorry I can't see you all, so hopefully this will go okay. So thanks for inviting me. I'm really happy to be part of this seminar series. And what I'm going to talk about today is basically sort of the linguistic patterning of iconicity in ASL. And hopefully I'll get to some of the neural consequences or non-consequences of iconicity. So the work I'm going to tell you about today is not just me alone. I work with a lot of great people. I'm going to introduce two teams. One is our ASL Lux team. In particular, Zed Zahir and Naomi Caselli have been instrumental in this project. Our ERP team, and I want to point out Kathy Midgley and Phil Holcomb. There are ERP EG experts. Their lab is just across the parking lot from ours, so it's a really nice collaboration. Of course, funding is important, although this work costs money. And I also want to highlight Cindy, who, if you know ASLX, you'll recognize her. She's the model for ASLX, and she's been integral to both of these teams. So I'm going to start by just saying something about what we think iconicity is. So I want to talk about it as a structured mapping, a similarity between form, that is a linguistic symbol, phonology, and meaning, so the referent. And different sign languages can have different iconic forms. So I'm just illustrating here the ASL sign for tree, the Chinese sign for tree, which has different types of iconicity. Within both of those language, iconicity, or these forms, are unconventionalized, so they're different, but each has a particular mapping from the form to some aspect of the semantic representation. And iconicity is particularly interesting because both linguistic theories and psycholinguistic theories tend to treat these very differently. So you have completely different semantic and phonological representations, but iconicity kind of challenges that because there's a clear relationship between the two. And the way I want to think about this relationship is starting with Sarah Taub's analog building model of linguistic iconicity. So in this particular model, you can have a concept, and languages then may select a particular image to represent that concept. And that image then needs to be schematized so that it can map onto the phonological units of that language. So you can see in ASL, the sign for bird, you have a projection of the beak that maps onto the two fingers. In Turkish Sign Language, you have a different type of mapping where the wings map onto the hands. Now, Sarah's model was a model to explain the patterns of iconicity that you see in both spoken and sign languages, but it was explicitly not a processing model. It was a linguistic description. But of course, I'm a psycholinguist. I'm interested in psychological processing and comprehension production. And so I turned to a model that drew on this type of structure mapping, but was an actual cognitive psycholinguistic model. And this was structure mapping theory proposed by Dedri Gentner and her colleagues. And this is a cognitive theory of analogy, which proposes that there is a structural alignment between two mental representations. And this structural alignment, it can explain patterns that we find in analogies and metaphors. And so using this type of theory, we can think of iconicity as a type of comparison, in particular between two mental representations, a mental representation of a referent and a mental representation of linguistic form. So here you can see there's a mapping between the bird's beak, and in ASL, the sign for bird and the fingers. You have a mapping from the bird's head to the signer's head. But there are also things that don't map. So, for example, color doesn't map from the referent to the sign. In the sign form, you have the unselected fingers, the folded fingers, the closed fingers. Those don't map. They don't map, for example, to the side of the face. Only selected fingers seem to map. So you can use this theory to try to understand what types of information get mapped between the two mental representations. And I want to explicitly state that I think it's important to think of the mapping as between mental representations. And it's not a mapping between the iconic form and the world. Lots of different birds. It's an abstraction of the experience with the world into a mental representation of a concept. And that's where the mapping occurs. Okay, so with this framework for thinking about iconicity, I want to then ask several questions today. So the first is just how are iconic signs distributed across the ASL lexicon, in particular making use of ASL Lex. I want to ask what drives the iconic depiction of semantic features? Why do certain semantic features get depicted and others don't? And then I want to turn to processing. Does iconicity impact language processing, production, and comprehension? And then finally, interwoven with that is the brain's response to iconic signs. Do we see a neural signature, for example, to iconicity? So let me start with the first question. How are iconic signs distributed across the lexicon? So to look at this, I'm going to turn to ASL Lex. And I think for this audience, I don't need to go into much explanation about this database. I think people know about this database. If you don't, please go and play with it. It's really quite interesting. The database includes ratings for frequency, how familiar a sign is for these 2,700 signs, iconicity ratings by both hearing non-signers and deaf signers, and phonological coding. And the network I'm showing you here is a phonological neighborhood. So these are signs that are related by their form, what they look like. And the size of the node is how frequent the sign is. So with this type of data, we can then look to see how does iconicity relate, for example, to frequency or to phonology. And one thing we've seen is that there is a relationship between iconicity and frequency, such that more iconic signs tend to be less frequent. Okay. So what you see on the graph there, you can see the iconicity ratings from low to high, frequency ratings from low to high, and the low iconic signs tend to be, I should say, we can do it the other way, the high iconic signs tend to be in low frequency distributions, right? So what we think is going on there is that when you, frequency tends to sort of change phonological form. There are sort of production articulatory pressures that may reduce the iconicity. And so you may see a two-handed sign that represents a plural, maybe could change to a one-handed sign. My favorite example of this sort of phonological change with frequency is the ASL sign for home. So the old sign was a compound between eat, and sleep. Eat and sleep. The modern sign for ASL is this, home. So you get phonological assimilation with the hand shape, with frequent use that really changes and you lose that iconicity. So this may be one reason why we see this tendency for more iconic signs to be less frequent, or high iconic signs to be less frequent. All right. We can also look at the relationship between phonology, in particular phonological neighborhoods, phonological density, and iconicity. So you can have a phonological neighborhood that doesn't have a lot of people living in it, a lot of signs living in it. So a sparse neighborhood made up with this hand shape, not that many signs, okay? A dense neighborhood I've shown on the right here, and I've circled the iconic signs. So this is a neighborhood made up of signs that have this S hand shape. So you have things like shoes, car, dice, Okay. And what we see is that more iconic signs tend to belong to denser phonological neighborhoods, more signs in the neighborhood. Now, this is interesting in part because this isn't what you see for spoken languages. In spoken languages, iconic words like idiophones or sound symbolic words tend to occur in sparse phonological neighborhoods. Okay? So sound symbolic words, idiophones, tend to have skewed, unusual phonotactic distributions. So things like in English, plop, hiss, hum. Okay? And the idea is that you need to distinguish between words that sort of sound the same. Now, we may see this difference in signs because of the gestural origin. So it may be that since sign languages tend to be younger languages, you have these gestural origins to signs, and that it may be that gesturers, when you use more unmarked hand shapes and neutral space and unmarked movements, which can create then a dense phonological neighborhood. So when you look at gesturers, you don't see lots of marked hand shapes, for example. So it may be that it's the sort of gestural origins of signs that lead to this denser phonological neighborhood for iconic signs. So now I want to turn to semantic density. So people looked at this for spoken language, and looking at semantic density as well as phonological density and iconicity is interesting because there's been arguments that iconicity can limit the ability to discriminate the forms of words with similar meanings. So there's a drive to have, for concepts with similar meanings, to have contrasted forms, different forms, to make them more distinguishable. And this apparently is true for particularly large lexicons with crowded semantic and phonological spaces. So computational work has suggested that when you have a small lexicon, iconicity can help with learning. But as the lexicon enlarges, when you have a large lexicon, then the network becomes more accurate with a more arbitrary lexicon. And when people have done this for English, they've looked at semantic density measured by lexical co-occurrence, so how often do words co-occur? And for both nouns and verbs, more iconic words tend to live in sparser semantic neighborhoods. So the lower the semantic density, then you see more iconic words. So one question is, and here iconic rating, iconicity is from raters of hearing, people rating the words. So we asked, can English semantic density predict iconicity ratings for English or for ASL? So this is kind of a data-driven analysis of iconicity and semantic density. Here we used the ASL or the English translations of ASL signs in order to do this study. So for both, more iconic signs and words tended to occur in semantically sparser neighborhoods. So you see this negative relationship. And sorry, I've kind of flipped the axis here for you guys. Semantic density is now on the y-axis, and iconicity rating is on the x-axis. But you can see there's this negative relationship for both English and for ASL. What's interesting is we looked then at highly iconic forms. And there we saw this relationship held for English, this negative relationship, but flipped for ASL, suggesting that highly iconic signs may be more easily discriminable in ASL. So you can see this positive relationship. And it may be that for these particular meanings, these highly iconic meanings, this drive for discriminability may be overridden by other factors. For example, sort of experience that really drives these highly iconic words so you can retrieve the meaning. And what we saw was there's more pockets of iconicity for ASL in these highly iconic regions where you can see concentrations of numbers, for example, body parts, body actions like sneeze and push, manipulable objects, all of these sort of pockets of iconicity that are supported by different form meaning mappings. Whereas in English, it was really just sound as a organizing feature for these iconic words. Okay, and this kind of is almost objective data that ASL is a bit more iconic than English. But of course, this study was based on English translations of the ASL signs, not on ASL-derived semantic neighborhoods. And so we conducted another study that looked at iconicity and semantic structure, but using data from ASL, in particular using sign associates, so that we could do this analysis of semantic density, as well as looking at relationships between semantic networks, semantic associations, and phonological networks, phonological associations. So in this study, which was a huge undertaking, participants were given a Q sign from ASL Lex, and they were asked then to produce the first three signs that came to their mind. Okay, so they might see the Q numbers, and then they would release the keyboard to start the camera. They would sign a word, maybe math, and then press down, and then that video would be saved. They would then give their next response, count their next response. And so all of these videos were then segmented and stored in the cloud. We had at least up to 15 people responded to each Q sign. We may have up to 45 different semantic associates per sign. And all of those were video recorded. Participants could delete a response if they made a mistake, but they couldn't go back and review. Okay, so that's how we got all of those associations. But then they're out there. You have to have some way of analyzing them, and so we developed a tagging system. So the person would see the Q sign numbers, and then they would see a person's video. And they would then type in a possible gloss for that sign. And then the signs from ASL Lex or from ASL Sign Bank actually would come up. And the person would then select that sign if it matched. Okay, so we had really over 100,000 possible associate responses. We had something like 64,000 that we could match with ASL Lex. So then, because ASL Lex has phonological coding for all of those signs, for phonological coding, frequency, and iconicity, we looked just at the signs, the tagged responses that were in ASL Lex. So we could look at the relationship between the Q sign and the semantic associates, and we could build these semantic networks. In addition, we could look at, again, as I mentioned, the relationship between semantics, networks, and phonology. So in this first study, we looked at the relationship between phonologically related signs or phonological relationships and semantic relationships. So what you see here on the x-axis are pairs of signs that were semantically unrelated. So nobody in the experiment, nobody in the study related those two signs. So there's like 6 million pairs that were not semantically related. No participant associated them. For the semantically related signs or pairs, at least one signer made an association. So we had about 9,500 of those semantic related pairs. And then on the y-axis here, you see the phonological coding. So near means that they were phonologically similar, far phonologically dissimilar. And as the main effect there, you can see that clearly semantically related signs tend to be phonologically related as well. You get this main effect where you have a nearer distance for phonology when you have semantically related near signs. Okay. And this is also true for spoken languages. I think it's a bigger effect in ASL, but you see the same relationship between phonological relationships and semantic relationships in English and in Spanish. But we also see this interaction. So if you look at the summed iconicity across the pairs, either low, medium, or high, you can see that for the semantically related signs, iconicity really makes a difference. So you can see that for the highly semantically related, they're very similar phonologically. Whereas when you look at the unrelated, you don't see that boost. So basically, iconicity kind of really magnifies this relationship between semantic and phonological similarity. This relationship, this boosting is there for English and Spanish, but it's much, much weaker than what you see in ASL. So what about semantic neighborhoods? So here, we also replicated what we found when we used the English translations. Now here, semantic density in the networks is defined a little bit differently. It's not co-occurrence, which is where how semantic density is measured in other studies and in the data-driven study. Here, it's how often a sign was given as a response to cues and how many response signs are given to that cue. So those two measures, technically in degree and out degree, give you this one measure of semantic density. And what we saw was negative correlations with those measures. So higher iconicity was associated with less semantic density. And so what's nice is this replicates findings with ASL-based semantic neighborhoods. So here we see a parallel with spoken and sign languages with respect to the relationship between iconicity and semantic density. So what about this idea of looking at highly iconic signs and looking for pockets of systematicity? Well, we did that looking at the summed iconicity of pairs when they were above 6. The sum was above 6. So these are iconic signs. And what we see here is what we've called iconic systematicity. So iconicity is motivated by the structure mapping between the meaning and form. So examples here are the ASL signs for, for comb, brush, hair dryer. Okay. You can see these are all semantically related and they're also phonologically related with respect to location, for example. In English or spoken languages, this would be something like words that contain a nasal cluster and relate to the nose. So snort, sneeze, sniff. Okay, so here's a motivated iconic relationship where you have sort of nasal sounds and the words relate to the nose. We can also talk about systematicity that's not iconic. So in spoken languages, this might be something like sound symbolism. So the gl in English, which is related to light. So we have English words glimmer, glitter, gleam, but there's no real motivation for this gl sound to relate to light. In ASL, we can see these signs, the ASL kinship terms that are systematically related to the head, with gender lower, female lower on the face, male higher on the head. So here, these are all non-iconic signs, but you have this systematic relationship between kinship terms and locations on the head in English. You can get these types of systematic form meaning mappings for spoken language too, but they tended to be mostly in pairs, things like brother, mother, junior, senior, hotel, motel. Mostly one word connect to another word rather than networks. So one interesting thing is that over half of the signs in our networks were represented within these systematicity networks, either iconic systematicity or non-iconic systematicity. And this seems to be much less for spoken languages. And I think this has to do with the nature of, or it's an effect of structure mapping. So for sign language, many more units, phonological units, can be mapped to meaning. So in our bird example, we had not only the head, we had the beak, we had the possibility of the beak opening and closing. There's lots of ways to sort of map the body onto different types of meaning, particularly visual, sensory motoric meanings. In spoken languages, it's often just one part of a word, like the vowel. So high vowels mapping to maybe small things, low vowels mapping to large things. There's just a much greater limitation in the way that form can be mapped to meaning in spoken languages. And I think looking at this, these networks also gives us some new clues into thinking about iconic patterns. So what you can see is iconicity relationships among signs that on their own are rated as low iconic. So the signs join, quit, resign, all have relatively low iconicity ratings. We call these sign-specific iconicity. But when you see it as a group, within a network, you can see the mapping. So join, quit, resign. You have two legs, sort of an entity that can move into a container or out of a container. Okay. On their own, you don't see that mapping, but when you see it as a group, you can find these motivated iconic mappings. So this is kind of going, yeah. And then you can also see the same thing in these sort of non-iconic systematic mapping. So you see the signs in ASL for empty, invisible, naked, vanished. They're all made with this hand shape, which may have something to do with sort of emptiness, right? So this on its own isn't an iconic mapping, but you can see this non-systematic association with this hand shape. So it's a little bit parallel to the phonemes in speech, so the GL example. So what I want to look at next is going from semantics to form. So previously, well, let me, I'm getting ahead of myself. So when you look at these holistic ratings, they obscure the fact that only certain semantic features are iconically depicted. Okay, so has a beak and chirps for the bird example. And our question was, which semantic features tend to be selected for iconic depiction? Now, some other work, which is really nice, has gone the other way. That is, for example, Karen Emmorey has a nice paper looking at the claw 5 hand shape. So starting with the phonology and looking to see what types of semantic information is encoded by this form. So, you know, whether it's the shape, whether it's the curving, whether it's the individual fingers, different semantic representations or meanings can be mapped onto this form. Or Kalle Borstel's nice study looking at plurals or two-handed signs marking or for plural concepts. So a form to meaning. Here we want to flip it, and we're kind of going from, oh, let's look at the semantic features. Which of those gets mapped onto an iconic form? So how do you do that? Well, what we did was we took semantic feature production norms from Ken McRae's work and from Ariel Borofsky. What these production norms do is they give a concept, an English word, and they ask participants to list as many semantic features as they can. Okay, and you collect this from a large number of speakers, and you get a list of semantic features for a given concept. And that's what the production norms are. So what we did was we selected from these norms words or concepts that had a single ASL sign translation. So if it was translated with sort of a classifier construction, we didn't include it. If it was translated, if it was a compound, we didn't include it because the semantic features are not are related to the entire compound, not to the parts where the iconicity might be in the parts. So we just had selected concepts that had a single sign translation. And then for each semantic feature, 3 ASL signers assessed whether it was iconically depicted. So you looked at each feature, was it depicted or not? And then from that data, we could conduct qualitative and quantitative analyses of what features tend to be iconically depicted. So we had 600 concepts. Over 8,000 semantic features were coded. I can tell you that this was a COVID project. So this is something that we could do without bringing people into the lab. what we found is that most semantic features, so over 85%, were not iconically depicted. And I'm giving you two examples here, one of the non-iconic sign Apple and all of its features that are listed, and one for the ASL sign for comb, which has a higher iconic rating and has a number of features that are depicted. So I don't think it's surprising that many features were not iconically depicted. And I think this is because our knowledge about concepts is quite rich. We know lots of things about these concepts. And there are limits to the amount of semantic information that can be depicted using the body across all of semantic features. So only certain ones get to be picked. So let me just show you the signs here, the sign for apple, the sign for comb. Okay. So our first question was, are more prominent semantic features, that is, many people listed that particular feature, were they more likely to be depicted? So if it was a very common feature across that many people thought of, and here the answer is yes. In fact, over half of the iconically depicted semantic features were in the sort of top 5 responses that people gave. And I'm giving you examples here where crocodile, the number one response was has teeth, and you can see the mapping of teeth in the sign. I'll show that. For jar, has a lid is the number one, and it looks like this. So I can't see the interpreters, so I'm hoping you can catch up. And then worn around neck, there were actually 4 different ASL versions, variations for the sign necklace. All 4 of them had this around the neck depiction. So here's what this one sign looks like. Okay. Our next question was, are unique semantic features more likely to be iconically depicted? So a unique feature means it's listed only for 1 or 2 concepts in the data set. So for example, siren as a feature has a siren was only listed for ambulance, has a trunk was only listed for elephant, for example. And what we found here was, yes, again, unique semantic features were more likely to be depicted. So I'm giving you examples here for belt. Worn at the waist was a unique feature across the database. And the sign looks like this. Has a cap for mushroom, again, unique. The sign looks like this. And my particular favorite, octopus, has tentacles, and it looks like this. So we also asked whether semantic features that are shared across many concepts are more likely to be iconically depicted. So this was a calculation of how common a feature was across the data set. And we thought that, well, maybe if it's a very common feature, it might be something that is more likely to be depicted because it's something that is shared. But in fact, it worked the other way around. So common semantic features were less likely to be iconically depicted. So here's some examples of common semantic features. So is an animal, is large, is fast, is round. But this particular finding is consistent with the idea that more distinctive semantic features, so more unique features, are more likely to be depicted. So then our last question was whether a certain knowledge type, so like visual, tactile, functional, this was coded in the McRae database, are more likely to be depicted. So for each feature, they coded what type of knowledge was encoded in that semantic feature. And not surprisingly, we found that visual form and visual motion semantic features were more likely to be depicted than other sensory information. It's not the case that these other sensory information features were never depicted. So for example, for sound, for speakers was R loud. The ASL sign for speakers looks like this. Okay, so this wide opening of hands and sort of spreading a finger sort of can depict this loudness. And for other knowledge types, functional, so used for turning for screwdriver, for example, we get, but not taxonomic is pretty unusual. Okay, so the next question was, does the number of iconically depicted features correlate with holistic iconicity ratings for signs? So is there a relationship between the number of semantic features and the ratings that we get? Hello? Are we okay? Okay. Can't see anyone, so. And the answer here is yes. So along the y-axis, we see the number of depicted features from few to many. Iconicity score, we see this nice relationship so that if you have more semantic features that are depicted, the iconicity rating tends to be higher. And I'm showing you two examples, one with low iconicity rating, school, and then brush, which has a number of features. And I'll show you those signs. So the sign for school looks like this, and brush looks like this. Okay, just to sum up, semantic features are more likely to be depicted in the form of a sign if they're salient, if they're prominent, and if they're particularly unique or distinctive. And this has interesting consequences because work has shown that the distinctiveness of semantic features plays a role in semantic memory. So distinctive semantic features speed access to word meaning more than shared semantic features. And for example, a feature verification task. So it would be interesting to see, this could be a driving factor why these types of features get depicted. It's also the case that words with greater feature distinctiveness tend to be acquired earlier. So this would be interesting to see, is this true for science too? Could this actually be a role for iconicity in language acquisition? And finally, we see that the number of iconically depicted semantic features contributes to holistic iconicity ratings. So the sublexical aspects of iconicity contribute to these holistic ratings. Okay. So I want to turn now to looking at the impact of iconicity on processing. And we're going to start with production. I don't think I'm going to get to comprehension. Here we're looking at evidence showing that pictures, so you elicit production with picture naming. That's one way to get at language production. And their pictures are named faster if they are named with iconic signs than with non-iconic signs. So this is correlation data. I'm not going to go through this for time, but this is basically showing that iconic signs are named faster in sign compared to spoken language. So you have the same speakers doing the same task, but in spoken language, there's no difference, but there is if you're doing the task in the sign language. So over and over again, iconic signs seem to be retrieved faster in picture naming. But the question is that the case? Is it the case that they're retrieved faster? So reaction times, there's a lot of processing that goes on between seeing the picture and naming and your naming response, the response time, right? So there's recognize the picture, retrieving the word, making a decision about whether this is the right word, all of that. So to sort of get at it, whether you really see this retrieval at this facilitation at lexical access, we turned to ERPs. So this is ERPs give you this sort of millisecond by millisecond measure, and so we can look to see in particular whether the N400, which is a index of semantic lexical processing, is affected by the iconicity. And the N400 is sensitive to lexical properties like frequency, so that you see it's reduced for high frequency words. So the question is about iconicity. Do we see a modulation of the N400, which would be indexing not decision processing or picture processing, but lexical access? So in this study conducted by Megan McGarry, who may or may not be online, we had 24 deaf signers. They named pictures either with iconic or with non-iconic signs. And the ERPs were time locked to picture onset, so we can see it from the very beginning. And then, as is typical in sign studies, response times are recorded by key release. So you see the picture, and then you release to produce the sign, and that reaction time is your naming time for the picture. So happily, we replicated all of those previous studies showing that pictures with iconic signs were named faster than with non-iconic signs. And we saw this reduced N400 for the iconic signs compared to the non-iconic signs, suggesting facilitation. And this is occurring in this time frame before the response time. So the response times you can see here are 600. This is happening before. So the idea is it's during lexical access, suggesting that iconic signs are easier to retrieve. But the question is whether that is general. Does it generalize, carry over to other types of tasks that are not picture naming? So in this task, we had the same deaf signers perform a translation task. Okay, so now you're seeing the English words for these pictures that you named, and you're producing the same ASL sign, but it's not a picture naming task, it's a translation task. So the idea is if iconic signs are just easier to retrieve, we should see the same facilitation in the translation task. And we counterbalanced whether people did the translation task first or the picture naming task. But what we see is it doesn't generalize. So we didn't see a difference in response times for iconic and non-iconic signs for the translation task, and we didn't see an effect on the ERP. So no difference between the neural response to iconic and non-iconic signs. So this actually replicates a paper by Mark Jimeno Martinez and Chris Baus. This is the first time in my life that I've been scooped, but it was great because we found the same thing. Now, Chris and Mark had a slightly different explanation for this difference in tasks. What they suggested was picture naming activates semantics more, which boosts the semantic to phonology mapping, which is why you see this difference in picture naming, but not in translation. But I have a different take on this, a different explanation that draws on this idea of structure mapping. So what I suggest is that the semantic and visual features that are depicted in a picture may prime lexical retrieval and phonological encoding for iconic signs. So if you look at the relationship between the pictures and the ASL signs, you can see a mapping between visual features of the picture and the phonological form of the sign that you don't see for non-iconic signs. There isn't that type of picture sign form mapping. And the suggestion is that it's that mapping that's allowing iconic signs to be named faster. And we have a bit of evidence for this, which again comes from Megan McGarry's studies, where here we manipulated how well the picture maps onto the sign. So the ASL sign for cat, like this, sort of depicting whiskers. We had a picture that was aligned, so showing the whiskers or not, less aligned. And what you see is at first an RT difference, more aligned pictures are named faster, and you see a difference in the ERP. So picture alignment reduces the naming times and the N400 for iconic signs, suggesting that when you have this better mapping between the picture and the sign, then you see this facilitation. Okay, so it is now 8:47, so I think I'm going to stop with production. And you can see how much I was going to show you. And I'll just go to the end and just kind of give you a wrap up, which is that we don't see this even distribution of iconicity across the lexicon. We see this negative relationship with, or positive relationship with frequency, with more iconic signs being less frequent, living in denser phonological neighborhoods. We see that iconicity shapes the structure of the lexicon in terms of these different networks and how what types of semantic features are selected to be depicted. We see that effects of iconicity are task dependent. And then what I didn't have a chance to show you is that we don't see a neural response that's associated with lexical variation and iconicity. And so I'm going to end there so there's time for questions and stop sharing.
Uh, Karen, thank you very
Yes.
much for talk. Once again, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Kirill. This is my sign. Yes, and now I invite the audience to ask questions, either by raising the electronic hands and then asking the questions themselves, or doing it in chat, typing in chat, and then I'm going to speak it up. One small comment for the recording. Uh, Before asking the question on your own, please wait for a couple of seconds so we can pin you for the future video. So the picture will be nice. It seems that everybody is so impressed, so I'm going to ask the first question, sort of to warm up the audience. Something in between the question and comment. You were talking about sign-specific iconicity, where the signs are not considered quite iconic, but they sort of are systematic. I have something which seems to be an antonym of it, but maybe I'm not understanding the concept fully, so please just comment on that. We, in Spanish sign language, we have a sign for apartment that for me, as a non-signer, does seem quite iconic. So you're sort of knocking at the door. But since the handshake that is used is mostly used for some handling signs, like, I don't know, a hammer, so manipulating small thin objects, the signers rate the signs very lower for iconicity. So uh, and even though potentially the sign is really iconic, uh, due to the fact that it doesn't form part of the sort of systematic form-meaning relations, it is rated low for iconicity. May this sort of evidence fit into your picture of sign-specific iconicity, or this is just some another topic?
No, I think it fits into the idea. In fact, one of the, you're right, it is a little bit opposite of what we were thinking about because our idea, we haven't done this, but those signs that are rated low but form part of this network, so the join, quit, those examples, we might expect that the signers would rate those as more iconic than hearing non-signers because they know the pattern that they participate in and the non-signers don't. We haven't tested that. We don't have iconicity ratings for those from deaf people for those all of those signs. So it's with this one, it's a little interesting though, because I would say this isn't a handling shape because for hammering, I would not hold a hammer like this. I would hold it like this, right? So to me, signers might be aware that, oh, this doesn't look like how you would hold it. I don't know. I think this hand shape is interesting because I think it's not handling.
Well, in Spanish sign language, it seems to be dedicated to like manipulating objects like hammer or like the cards. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, ASL also uses this, but again, just in terms of the
Mhm.
gestural aspect of it, that's not how you hold a hammer.
Mhm. Okay, and we have questions from chat. First question from Likesar, who used to be the speaker in our seminar as well. The question is, how is iconicity distributed across ASL parameters, hand shape, location,
Oh,
etc.?
that's a good question. I'd have to think how to do that. You'd have to do something like, I mean, you could do this in ASLX, basically group signs by, let's say, location. and look at the holistic rating to see whether, let's say, signs made at the head tend to have higher holistic iconicity ratings. I'm not sure what I would do with that information because you need to know what the mapping is. But it's something that you guys out there could play around with, and you could look at it, right? Because all of that data is there in ASLX, and you however you want to code, location, hand shape, and then look at the iconicity ratings. Again, it's holistic iconicity ratings, but it would give you maybe a sense if there's, but it wouldn't tell you what the mappings are. But it's interesting.
Next question from Michael E. Skyer. I'm curious about the brain regions involved and not involved in decoding iconic signs. It seems that they tend away from movement centers. Why might that be? Is iconicity perceived as relatively static by the brain of deaf signers, based on voltage maps in addition?
So I didn't get a chance to, because I put too much into it. I decided to wait the top end and not get to the neuroscience stuff. But there isn't a brain region that responds to iconicity. So when we look across comprehension perception, we can see that you get these neural responses to frequency. So more negative for less frequent. It actually tends to be anterior and then more posterior, which we think has to do with sort of form frequency and then lexical frequency. We see effects of concreteness, but we see absolutely no effects of iconicity on modulating the brain response to sign recognition. In production, again, it's a picture priming thing. So what you saw was the location moved a bit. Sometimes it was more anterior for the picture priming, which kind of fits with the picture literature, but it's a priming effect from the picture to the sign. At least that's what my argument is. So we don't see really strong, iconic specific responses to signs. So the brain isn't tracking the iconicity like it is tracking frequency or concreteness. So the other way to think of it is that iconicity isn't represented with lexical items in the same way that frequency and concreteness are. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I think we have space for a couple of questions, and one question just came now from Robert. For studying comprehension and retention of newly coined STEM signs in DGS with first-time learners, would you recommend a holistic 7-point iconicity ratings, a transparency guessability paradigm, or a combination of both?
I would say a combination of both, in part because one of the things I didn't get to talk about was the learning study that we've done. And if we looked at sort of highly iconic signs, which were also transparent, and we saw interesting learning patterns. So those hearing learners knew before they even knew them. So their brain responded, showing that they were processing semantically these highly iconic transparent signs, things like drink and smoke. And then the non-iconic signs, then they had to learn. And over time, you saw an increase in the N400. So depending on what your goal is, if your goal is for people to understand and retain these signs, highly iconic and transparent signs are going to function differently than iconic signs that may not be rated as transparent. So for people, I'm using transparency to mean basically guessable. Meaning that they can guess the meaning. And so those two measures give you slightly different information. Hope that helps.
Thank you. And I guess the last question for today will be asked by Carlo Geraci. So, Carlo, please ask your question, but wait a second until you've been pinned.
Can I ask my question now?
Yes, sure.
Well, first of all, Karen, thank you very much for this beautiful lecture. As always, we learned a lot when we attend your your talks. I have one clarification about the comparison between the networks that you found in ASL and possible parallels in spoken languages. If I understood it correctly, you mentioned in passing that so the size or the dimension or whatever of these networks is much higher in signs versus spoken languages. If not, then I'm okay. Okay, then
So
I'm
what do you mean by
mistaken.
size? Because
Okay.
the paper that Zed is the lead author on, that's under review, looks at the nature of the semantic networks in ASL compared to English. Where you see, if you're just looking at,
Mhm.
so I'm not sure what you mean by size, but in there you find parallel small world structure.
Okay.
I think she even talked about this in one of the Signing Minds.
So my question is more related to for how long this iconic network would keep their density. As we know that, I mean, as time goes, phonological change applies to all sorts of signs, including iconic signs. And one of the things that we know is that iconic signs tend to lose their iconic features. So is there any trend that you can see what would be like in 100 years from now, the size and the shape of iconic networks for
So
ASL?
that's a great question. I don't have an answer for that. I have things you could look. One thing you could look to see if anyone's done this in the spoken language world, if they have, for example, data would be written, but from Old English, for example, do those change over time? With sign, we might be able to do something looking at old films. It would be hard to, because you'd want to know, what the older signs were, and that it's one aspect, right? So in terms of historical change, so you have lots of factors that can be having pressure. So there may be pressure, for example, to keep some iconicity. So people have argued, I think Sarah Taub did, that in spoken language, like the word peep for the sound a bird makes, didn't undergo the vowel shift because it's so iconic. And so it resisted it. So there may be pushes and pulls. There may be a certain amount of iconicity that resists the phonological change and some that gives into it. So it may be more complicated than it always gets rid of iconicity. There may be some resistance too, depending on the semantics.
Thank you very much. Let me briefly mention in passing that there seems to be work on that topic on spoken languages. I think Maria Flaxman, I cannot pronounce the name correctly for sure, and she identifies sort of a cycle of words losing iconicity over time. And when the word becomes completely aniconic, then it makes room for new iconic items to enter in the same semantic domain.
Yeah, so I would expect sign languages to do the same thing, but it's an empirical question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now I think it's time to say thank you again for Karen. And yeah, due to the time, it's time to finish our seminar. Thank you for everybody who attended the seminar. Thank you for your wonderful questions. Thank you for our wonderful interpreters. Thanks a lot.